that's better. Unmute that tab.
Okay, so now I'm going to make the announcement on Gather. So if either of you have Gather enabled, then you're going to get feedback.
I turned it off just to be simple.
Muted the tab.
Okay, so. All right, so I just made the announcement on Gather. We only have 4 people connected to the live stream though, so something potentially strange might be going on.
Okay.
I don't think we've met, Sage, so good to meet you.
Good to meet you, Brian. It's always good to put a face to a name too.
Yeah.
And once we're done here, I would love a chance to chat to you because I'm also running a solo business with Racket. Love to hear about your experience.
Oh, sure. That'd be great.
Well, so we've got more people joining.
Okay.
So that's good.
Are we currently audible to them right now?
Yep, you're audible to them.
That's all right. We're not saying anything embarrassing. Let's talk about embarrassing trade secrets and all our past employers.
So if I start the live stream, will I get the feedback also? Because it'd be nice to see what's going on in the live stream.
Yeah, so what's going to happen is once we're ready to really start, I'm actually going to mute both of you and turn off your videos inside of this. So you will be free to do that. I'm going to mute myself as well. The Zoom is just for the question and answer right afterwards.
Okay.
So I'm waiting. I want to wait to start in at 2:30. So we'll wait, 5 more minutes.
All right.
Maybe I should have waited to mute everyone on the Gather a tiny bit longer to give them a few more minutes to talk. I got a little bit jumpy.
I think it'll all be okay. In truth, after the, adding Gather on top of Zoom, I was actually having trouble visualizing where things start. Like where video and audio comes from. Like, oh, okay, got it. So I'm glad you said.
My sister-in-law came to visit, and I was just downstairs telling her how everything is set up. She's like, wow, that's very interesting. It was sort of a, that's interesting, i.e. that's crazy. I can't believe you're doing it that way.
Well, again, thank you for inviting us.
All right, welcome everyone back to RacketCon. We'll have 2 more talks right now. So the first one will be from Brian Adkins on web development. Say hello, Brian.
Hello.
And then the next will be from Sage Gerard on his new dependency management system. Say hello, Sage.
Hello.
And as before, we'll have question and answers directly after the talk on the live stream, and then we'll transition to gather for the hallway track with Brian will be in the northeast corner, sorry, the northwest corner, discussion area A, and Sage will be in the northeast corner, discussion area B. So I'm now gonna fiddle with my computer for a little bit to share the video, and bear with me for just one moment.
Hello, Racketeers. I'm Brian Adkins. Welcome to my home office near Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. I've been having a blast coding Racket full-time in my business over the last 2 years, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about next. I've been programming professionally for almost 4 decades, but the last 2 years using Racket full-time have been the most fun of my career. I was chatting with a friend recently. I think he wishes he could use Haskell more in his work, and when he found out I was programming Racket full-time, he responded with this message: "You're living the dream." And I have to agree. It took me about a decade of active searching to find my ultimate programming language, and I'll discuss that a little bit later. I develop mainly web applications, so if I were to use Racket in my business, I would need some web infrastructure. I could have created that before I launched, but I decided to just build what I needed as I went along. It's not an approach I would recommend for everyone, but it was an exciting one. So the code in the example app is in the make it work phase. It will answer a lot of questions about how you do certain things in web development, but it's not yet beautiful, and I wouldn't consider it a framework or even a library at this point. So if I don't have a beautiful web framework to show off, why am I here? I have a story for you. It's a story I wanted to hear a few years ago myself, and it's a story that I think everyone that considers a new language wants to hear. It's a story of success with Racket. Yay! And I also have an example web app that you can download from GitHub, complete with configuration scripts for deploying in a production environment, load balancing, setting up a Linux server, etc. I think I learn best by example, so having a complete app that has a lot of features where you can extract little pieces for your own apps, I think is a very helpful tool. This slide is a pretty good summary of my last 2 years with Racket. We have a couple apps in production, a number of external systems, vendors that we have to interact with. We call them, they call us. A pretty sizable database that I think will stress just about any system. A CICS mainframe integration. That's an interesting one. It's actually screen scraping a 3270 terminal, and I haven't seen one of those since my mainframe days back in the 80s. The reliability has been outstanding. The servers have never crashed. Performance has been great. Customers are happy. I think if I had to describe my experience very concisely, I would say it's been one pleasant surprise after another, and that's a good feeling to have. I mean, I've asked so many questions on the forums, how do you do X, Y, or Z? And the answer always comes back, well, here's how you do it. It's something straightforward. It's something built in that I missed, or there's another library. I've never been stuck with Racket. I've never gotten into a corner that I didn't know how to get out of. I can't say enough good things about the Racket software itself, the distribution, the libraries, the extra contributed libraries that I depend on. And I know a lot of you that have created those are here at the conference. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to give you a sincere thank you. And I think I can best give you thanks by contributing my own libraries in the future, and I plan on doing that. You know, vetting a language before you use it very heavily is tricky. You can only research it so much. It's not really until you get in the trenches and use it for months and years that you discover if there are any serious problems. And after having a couple programs in production for several years now under heavy use, I'm happy to report that Racket has exceeded all my expectations. In hindsight, it was a fantastic decision. For the example, I chose a to-do app. It's simple, but it demonstrates a surprising number of features. All the code for the example app is in the GitHub repo, along with some configuration scripts for deployment, etc. Since all the code's in the repo, we'll just walk through a few examples. Here's the basic architecture. We'll have a Nginx web server as the front end. In production, I use that to handle SSL and static files, as well as to load balance between multiple Racket processes. And we'll have one Racket web server process per core, and each of those is multi-threaded. We'll also have a Postgres database. And the main difference between this and maybe a fuller production example would be simply more Racket web server processes. Since we're using an entirely stateless architecture for the web, these could live anywhere. They could be on multiple servers, and we could load balance between them. I'd also recommend using a separate database server. Amazon makes this super easy with RDS, and that's what I use in production myself. But I'm probably getting ahead of myself. How did I arrive at the decision to base my business on Racket? I suppose my road to Racket began when I was born. Now I just had to wait for a personal computer. I'll never forget walking by a Radio Shack store in the early 80s, seeing some display in the window, and I was immediately hooked. I actually had 2 paying clients for software on this computer, even though the storage at the time was a simple cassette player. One of them was the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. The bar was pretty low in the early 80s. Somehow I got the idea that real programmers needed to use big iron, so I became a systems programmer and did System 360 assembler for a while. But I was wrong. Cool programmers use little iron. And I started off with PC assembler, close to the metal, DOS interrupt service routines, moved up the stack a little bit to C, and I love this book. It's so thin, so concise. I spent about a decade with C++. Classes were interesting. Memory errors were kind of a pain. Another decade with Java, and I still remember exactly where I was in the office at CheckFree. A friend of mine came over and said, "Have you heard of this Java thing?" And I also remember that the first program just worked with no memory errors to debug. But things eventually took an ugly turn, and developing web apps with Java and Hibernate and Spring was no fun at all. Finally, I came to Ruby and Rails. I spent over a decade here. I consider Ruby my gateway language to Racket, and Rails got a lot of things right and a number of things wrong. So for my Axio Web Framework, I want to keep the good, leave the bad, and add some Rackety goodness. The boost in productivity and enjoyment I got from switching to Ruby from Java was so significant, I think it naturally begged the question, can I do that again? What else is out there? And really, for the first time, I began to proactively research languages. Prior to this, it was typically a job requirement or a suggestion from a colleague, but now I began to be a little bit more active in my search. That's a little embarrassing to admit in front of a bunch of PLT people. So almost as soon as I began experiencing Ruby's benefits, I began looking for Ruby's successor. And my first stop was static typing. I still have very fond memories of all 3 of these languages. Who doesn't appreciate the quicksort algorithm in Haskell? And I did grow to appreciate type systems, but ultimately they weren't going to be my primary language. I spent a little time with some of these and a lot of time with others of them. And finally, I circled back to Ruby and tried to find out what was it that I really liked about this language. And I discovered Mats was inspired by both Lisp and Smalltalk. After 30 years of programming in an object-oriented manner with C++ and Java and Ruby, I'd seen enough behind the curtain that I knew that that wasn't the way I wanted to approach things, at least by default. But this Lisp idea was interesting. I love this XKCD. So there's a lot of Lisps. Which one? When I resumed playing electric guitar late in life, I chose a Stratocaster. And it's a fine guitar. A lot of great music has been created with this. But it's also got a lot of complexity. 3 pickups, 3 knobs, a 5-way switch, a vibrato bar, etc. So maybe think of this as common Lisp. A little bit too much. Eventually, I discovered the Telecaster. A couple of pickups, 2 knobs, a 3-way switch, simplicity, elegance, and perfection. I think of this as Scheme. Let's just bask in this code for a moment. If you don't find that beautiful, you might be in the wrong place. So after searching for about a decade for Ruby's replacement, I was getting closer. I had decided on Scheme. Okay, which Scheme dialect? I could probably make an entire talk about why Racket, but a few specifics that quickly came to mind are these. On Complang Lisp, I kept seeing these posts of new releases for this PLT Scheme thing. And this happened over years, and that just left a strong impression about how well supported the language was. And Paul Graham sparked an interest in Lisp, like with a lot of people. And ironically, the realization that Arc was just a very thin veneer over Racket steered me towards Racket. And that Arc post was a little bit of a tipping point. You may want to look that up later. I can't say enough good things about the Racket community, and people really are the most important factor in evaluating a language, at least in my opinion. Lisps have historically been great at dividing and conquering themselves, but I feel that Racket has critical mass. As far as the history, some languages age well and many do not, so along my way of searching for languages, the age of the language was very important to me. I wanted to make sure that it had grown well, both in the software and the community, and with a new language, you just really can't tell that. But, you know, I had all sorts of reasons for choosing Racket, but now after 2 years of heavy use, I think I'm at peace with the simple fact that I simply just enjoy it more than others. There are a lot of good objective reasons, but it fit my personality, and every morning when I pull up Emacs and start coding in Racket, I get happy. The To-Do app has just a couple prereqs and 1 configuration file to edit, then it should just work. So let's run through a quick demo. I'll switch to screencast mode for that. The setup step installed a admin user, so we'll go ahead and log in with that. You can check the user model file for the password. Great, we've got a blank slate, so why don't we go ahead and create a new to-do item. Now we'll create a bunch more. We've got a list of to-dos, and these will actually be what we'll do in the demo. So let's grab the first one and edit a to-do. Next, we'll complete a few to-dos. Why don't we go ahead and add a filter now to just show the active to-dos. Now's a good time to export the CSV file of all the to-dos. If we open that file, this is what we'll see. Next, we'll add a comment to a to-do. Now we'll delete that to-do at the bottom of the list. Now we'll create a non-admin user to demonstrate the last few features. So as a non-admin, we don't have access to exporting to-dos or the user menu. We also can't edit or delete another user's to-dos, but we can add one of our own. And there we can edit and delete. We can also add a comment to another user's. And we can delete those as well. The last feature is sending a notification email when a comment is left. So we're now logged in as admin. We'll put a comment on Brian's to-do. Hopefully you heard my email notification, but it did work. And now we can just clean up the rest of these to-dos. Now that you've seen the to-do app, let's take a look at some of the code. Here's the main module, and we simply call Axio app init with an environment symbol, a route function, and a function to get a user. Here's the directory structure just to give you a feel for how things are laid out. And we'll take a look inside the Axio directory. Again, I should emphasize this is not framework or even library code, but it is roughly 1,200 lines of utility code that should save a lot of time. The Axio environment file is meant to live outside of source control. So there's an example file in the repository that you can rename and edit. And there's just a few configuration values. SMTP values are irrespective of environment. And then the database credentials, database name, etc., are specific to production test or whatever environment you need. My initial routing needs were pretty simple. So in this case, the route function just uses match. And at the bottom, there are two guards, one to make sure we have a user. In other words, they've logged in. And the second one ensures they're an admin user in the case of exporting to-dos. The flip side of routing is URL generation, and for that, there's a URL for function. We give it a route name and possibly some arguments. This is an example of a potential future syntax for routing. Eventually, I'd like to have one declaration that generates the route function as well as the URL generation. Dispatch rules does this, but I think I'm going to be diverging from what it provides later, so that's why I started with these two separate functions. Here's the web context struct that's provided to all the controller actions. It has the Racket web server request, a hash of attributes, the session hash, database connection, the inner Axio context object, and the user. So let's just look at a couple controller actions. This is the action for logout, and it simply operates on the context. We first remove the user ID from the session, then we set a flash message saying you've been logged out and redirect the user to the root URL. For streaming the CSV file of all the to-dos, we first make sure that the user has permission to do so. And then we call stream CSV response with a file name and a generator. And that's been defined in the to-do model. Lastly, there's an example of sending emails. When a comment is added to a to-do, we notify the to-do owner that a comment's been added. And the Axio worker thread is simply to allow the thread to live beyond the web request thread. And thanks to Bogdan for helping me get that working. The send email function is just a very simple wrapper around the SMTP send message function. Lastly, we'll just cover some sysadmin details. The GitHub repo has a setup script that will set up a new Ubuntu Linux server if you don't already have a way of doing that. And it'll perform some security things on there and install Racket, get everything set up. And then to configure Nginx, this is the bit that does the load balancing. So you can have as many Racket web servers as you want. In this case, we have two, one listing on port 5301, one on 5302, and Nginx will distribute requests between those two processes. And I use systemd to manage the Racket web processes. It will start them at boot time. It'll restart them if they do crash. And these are just some examples at the bottom for, if you're not familiar with it, how to enable it, start processes, restart them, etc. As I mentioned earlier, I've had the most fun of my career over the last 2 years coding Racket. But one thing that would make it better would be to have more people involved in web development. So if there's anything I can do to help to that end, please contact me on Slack. And looking forward to the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sage.
All right, thank you, Brian. We're going to switch now to questions. Okay, so the first question is...
Actually, can I make a quick announcement?
Sure.
There will be a configuration script for setting up Linux. It's not yet in the repository, and I just realized I failed to add that. So that'll be over the next few days. I'll be adding some configuration scripts. So if you need those, they'll be available.
Great. Okay, so there's quite a few questions, and a lot of them are kind of detailed. So don't feel like you have to answer them in great detail. But so the first one is, have you built responsive web pages with Racket, i.e. ones that work seamlessly from computer, phone, and tablet? Is there something interesting about that in your work?
Well, for that aspect, I typically rely on designers. So that's one reason I chose a templated approach, is I can literally give them the template files and they can do their magic as far as what they need to with changing some structure, adding CSS. And typically the responsive aspect is mostly CSS. I think the To-Do app might be. I just used a simple off-the-shelf CSS file. I haven't tried it on my phone, but it may change with different sizes.
Great.
But that's outside of my typical domain, which is server side.
Okay, and is it also right to assume then that you don't have anything to say about the front-end JavaScript world and how you're interacting with that?
Well, I have something to say, and that is I would like to see, and I would be happy to be involved in this, something similar to ClojureScript for Racket. I know there have been a few attempts, and I'm not sure what the status is currently. I haven't used them, but I would love to be able to use Racket in that context. So if other people are interested, please contact me and I'll offer whatever I can.
Great. So on the question of scaling, remember how you said that you have that in your diagram you had 2 Racket servers, and you talked about how in your deployment you have more. Is it plausible to have 100 Racket servers and the extremely large scaling that we see in other pieces of software?
Yeah, I think so. I haven't done that, but there's the part that deals with that is outside of the Racket infrastructure, so it doesn't depend on it. It would be either Nginx or an Amazon load balancer or whatever. But the architecture allows for those processes to live on separate computers, which is, I think, what you need to have that horizontal scaling. So I don't see any particular limit for that.
Great. There are a number of different form frameworks in Racket. So there's formlets that come with the web server. There's Bogdan's form stuff. Can you talk about how you're doing forms, whether you have anything special in Axio?
Yeah, there's it's fairly manual now. My plan is to do something similar to what I've experienced with Rails, which is just to have a number of different tags that kind of encapsulate different elements, text fields, selection, drop downs, things like that. But in the To-Do app and in the code that's available there, it's very fairly manual. It's just, here's how you do it manually. And what I'll be doing with Axio is making that nicer. So.
Great. So one thing that you kind of talked about a little bit when you're talking about your history of programming is coming to Racket because it is a beautiful, simple language. Now, obviously, us in the Racket world, we agree with this sentiment. And within Racket, there are sort of simple parts of Racket and really complicated advanced parts of Racket. So, for instance, sometimes you need these functions that are this long on your screen. Like syntax, local, something, 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 something. And other times you're just using the elegant parts of the elegant, simple parts of Racket that appear in other languages, but maybe are just straightforward. So anyways, do you feel like in your framework you're using those advanced things? Do you have macros throughout your code? Or are you mostly using functions? Can you talk a little bit about, how much is it Racket because it's beautiful and how much of it Racket because it's Racket?
Right. Most of it currently is Racket because it's beautiful. And I wouldn't say necessarily a scheme core. For instance, I love the match macro, which is, I don't think there's an analogous thing quite like that. There are one or two macros I'm using for the rendering of templates, but it's interesting. Macros are one of the strengths of Racket, and it's one of my weaknesses. And so once I resolve that, I think for the router syntax, I'm going to need some advanced macros. And so I will be depending more and more on those features. But right now it's mostly functions with a few macros. And yeah, so that's the state.
Great. Do you depend on other languages and or tools in a good way or in a bad way? How does Racket fit into the polyglot web ecosystem for you?
Well, currently it's only Racket. That's why it's all server-side rendering. Well, there is some JavaScript. I mean, you're not going to not have JavaScript. So Racket and JavaScript are the two languages. In the future, I have been looking into some ways of integrating Julia, whether it be through a foreign function interface or two processes communicating over a socket, that sort of thing. It's interesting, Kathy mentioned, not having, not attempting to have one language to rule the world. And I think that is wise, but yet my personality is to try to maximize how much I can do with that one language. But where there are better tools, interfacing with them is certainly the right thing to do.
Great. So someone asked the question, can you compare Axio to the Elixir Phoenix framework? I don't know what that is.
Yeah, well, so, a lot of people in the Ruby community moved to the Elixir language, and Phoenix is one of their web frameworks. So Elixir is a functional language similar to the way I use Racket, and so there are a lot of analogs. I hate to even say the Axio framework right now. It's a idea with some experimental code that will be the ingredients to form it later. So I haven't decided whether I'll be modeling the database aspect from Ecto, which is their functional query DSL for the most part, but I guess it will be similar only in the fact that they're both will be a functional type framework.
Can we nail down any promises about when you're going to release this so that other people can build their businesses on Axio as well?
Well, I can probably answer that by saying my original plan was to have a great talk on the completed Axio framework for the 2019 RacketCon. So I'll let people draw their own conclusions to that. But I will say this, I'm working full-time in Racket, and the code that I have, simply the level it's at, it represents my needs at the time, which were the vast majority of the 20,000 lines of code or whatever is just back-end code that could be in a batch process. It's not web specific. It's just very technical, general purpose code. I'll be starting several new apps, which will have much higher web needs, typical of a Rails application. And so because of that, that's very strong motivation to finish those parts, to have, the view with the tags available, a nice functional database query, DSL, et cetera. So I'm not going to say any dates, but I would say by next year's RacketCon, I would definitely have something that I would consider at least 1.0 framework that I would feel good about publishing.
Do you want contributors and collaborators at this point, or are you? It's your baby right now.
No, I would. It's hard. It might be hard for contributors to contribute because the structure isn't quite there yet. But that doesn't mean, a lot of these pieces are going to be simple functions, right? Standalone functions. And so, yeah, contributions would be great. And I hope to get the structure together so that it would be a little bit easier for people to contribute. And I don't plan on doing it all myself. So if there are particular interest, for instance, the database and something similar to Ecto, that would be a standalone project. That would be great. So yeah, please contact me if there's any interest. And I have to plead a little ignorance of what might be out there already in the Racket community. And so I don't want to reinvent things that are there. So if you spot things like that, I'd be glad to, merge or switch over to other libraries as needed.
Great. And one last question. Are you building infrastructure for AWS Lambda deployment and Docker files and things like that?
No, I'm not. My approach thus far is I've got a script that could easily be used in some of the management frameworks like Puppet and the ones that have come after. But I set up Amazon EC2 instances and RDS servers for the database. And so I guess it's a more direct approach. It's not a Docker file or a container of any sort.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much, Brian. Clap, 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 clap. All you out there, you're clapping. And we'll turn off our videos right now and we'll switch to Sage's talk. And recall that Brian will be in the Northwest area discussion A during the hallway session. Thank you, Brian.
Great. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Sage Gerard, and welcome to Zero Collection Package Management. I'm here to talk about a dependency manager I wrote called Zyden, and thank you to the RacketCon organizers for giving me a chance to talk to everybody about this today. Why write a dependency manager if Racco package already exists? That's, I think, the big first question and totally reasonable to ask. So, Racco package and Racco setup are people building furniture in a room. They take a package, it's full of parts, call your source code, and they're looking for these info.racket files to act as assembly instructions. They build the furniture, and the installation, that is the room, gets better. But anybody who's filled a house full of stuff knows you can't do quite the same things with the room once the furniture is there. So this leads to very strange situations, if you don't mind me torturing the metaphor, where you can't install a kitchen because there's already a dish rack in the bathroom. And it gets that strange because of the relationship between packages and collections. When every package defines at least one collection, you're in a situation where you need to have some scoping, but it's not there. Conflicts make it hard to reconcile how you're supposed to get two packages that have conflicting modules to work together. And this is intended behavior, right? There's expectations on how you're supposed to share code in the Racket community, but I don't really work that way. I don't really have the same level of commitment to backwards compatibility for one set of libraries, and I wanted to give users a way to adjust with my major changes in code without having to tweak their installation endlessly, or even to know how to do that. So I wanted to remove the magic from the process and minimize the subjective elements in the project that is in Zyden. I can't say that I eliminate it because there's always going to be a subjective element, but I derived a lot of my inspiration from geeks and nicks. If you're not familiar with what those are, geeks and nicks are basically dependency managers that apply functional programming to package management and getting the stuff you need. So you're thinking of installation as a pure function. You have inputs, you have outputs, and it happens without any, we'll say without any additional side effects or unexpected behavior. It's very nice. But why use Zyden if they exist? The big reasons are that Zyden experiments with a versioning scheme that you see in the Racket's, I've seen in the Racket Slack, where you version your software as if it were a book with additions and revisions. I think there's a lot of potential with this, since it lets you segment your user space more nicely and come up with more social arrangements. There's also Windows support. Geeks and nicks do not support Windows. You're expected more to use them under Cygwin or a Windows subsystem for Linux, and that I think it's better to just have the support on Windows entirely, since it's written in Racket. Racket runs on Windows, so why not? Then, of course, Racket being an orchestrator of cross-ecosystem work here, reproducible builds, that's a huge thing for me because I love using Racket. I'd love to do things like take Frog and install not only Frog the package for generating static websites, but also the Python installation and the Pigments package it needs to highlight source code. Having all of that available with one tool would just be nice, and using Racket as a tool for defining certain subsets or certain kinds of software distributions, really it was just kind of a goal. I really wanted to have that. And whether you do or not, it's still, you could still use geeks or nicks for various reasons. I'm not saying that Zyden's better. I'm just saying those are the differences that I think make it a contender. Now, these pros and cons here are actually hard to understand without looking at a demo. So in the interest of time, I can't show you everything that I want to show you. But what I can do is show you basic functionality of Zyden just to get a feel for what the workflow is like. So here in this terminal, I'm in a directory that has a single definition file. And that's it. There's no big sprawling set of source code here. There's just only one file needed to define a software distribution. So that way you can say exactly from an ivory tower, this is what it looks like to go from nothing to a built package. And in this definition, we're going to find the same kind of discovery information you'd expect near the top. But what's interesting is what's going on down here. There's inputs, outputs, and a processing step in between. These inputs have a lot of information, but basically it boils down to, hey, I want a file in my build directory called minimal.tgz. It comes from here. Here's the sources. Here's the integrity information, so you know you got the right thing. And here's a signature. It's where, assuming you trust this public key, to verify that it actually came from the provider. So all this together means that you are declaring a package as a program and what exactly it's going to do. And you use these definitions in a transaction where if there's a failure, everything rolls back and you're fine. You just find the source of the problem without worrying about your file system being left in an inconsistent state. So you use this not with an install command. This does not exist. You use a do command. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a flag that adds an installation to the scope of work for the transaction. I'm going to use a short flag A. This stands for abbreviated installation. And I'm going to say, here, take this definition and run with it. So what it's going to do is it'll check through the source. It says, oh, it's not in the file system. It finds out it's on the web. It gets it. It verifies everything. Okay, it's the right bytes. Okay, it's according to this public key. It's fine. And then it says, I built the default. Don't worry so much about what this string means. Just know that it's basically an abbreviated way of communicating the discovery information near the top of a definition. That's one of those things I'm going to have to skim over due to time. But you can see it issued me a symbolic link. It's called File Watchers because the package is called File Watchers. And inside the directory linked by that symbolic link, there's a bit of documentation and a module. And I kept this build simple. I didn't compile these Racket modules. All I did was I just basically left the input that I was using around just because I'm being a dirty boy. And I've got all of these, things from the archive available to me. And that's great. But the way that I'm going to basically leverage this is as if it were part of my project, because since it's a symbolic link, I can make other things in my project use the files through that. And because we're using functional programming practices, you can think of that command, oops, I stepped one out too far. You can think of that command as binding a link to an output directory. And because I bound something, well, what happens if there's no reference? Then you have something out there that is now eligible for garbage collection. Zyden remembers the links it made, and it can prove that now some things are unreachable, and it will recover those things. Of course, if you issued several links and you delete one, they're still fine, because it's still going to be around because they're still reachable. Now we're going to step over to one more example before I start to wrap things up. This example is a little simpler. I am depending on the file watcher's definition from the last example. Now I'm using that definition as a dependency. And I'm doing something similar in the build. I'm installing it, but this time I'm picking the name of the symbolic link, and I'm picking the output of the package I want. So from the earlier definition, there was a default archive and a minimal archive. I'm using default in this case. And here's the input cited. And also note, I'm not using a signature this time. I've configured Zyden just for adding some color to this demo, such that I'm going to trust unsigned input in this case. That's just for the demo, not recommending you do that. It's really just to show you that it can. So this time I'm going to use a more complicated command. And actually, before I do that, go ahead and note that there's this main.racket file here that really just loads up a file that doesn't exist. If I run it, it's going to complain. And that symbolic link there is just pointing back to the old definition to kind of clean up the code in here. So all that being said, I'm going to run a transaction that's a little more verbose. I'm going to say install source, the short form of that being S, and I want a symbolic link called vendor. And I want to use the default output of this definition. When all of that happens, you're going to see the same kind of things fly by here. It worked, and you're going to find that I now have a symbolic link called vendor. And it acts as the link to the output for that definition. It satisfies the path in the main.racket file, so it no longer errors out. All that being said, we now have this build system that instead of doing an install and an uninstall command, you are running a transaction and issuing links to yourself. You don't have to worry about a whole bunch of names clobbering in some directory elsewhere because you control the names of everything when they're referenced in your project. So let's go over the pros and cons, since I don't want to lie to you by giving you too rosy of a picture. There are trade-offs. So the good parts, no side effects on the Racket installation. There's no dependency hell. Things are installed side by side when there's any variation. And because of the transactional nature, failure is not going to break anything. You can issue links, so you can declare what you want where you want it. It feels like third-party code is naturally meshed with your code. And you can also use pastebin, gist, email to write abbreviated definitions to share with each other to say, hey, what if the software was like this? And somebody could install that and try it without interrupting anything else or conflicting with anything else. This does mean, of course, you're dealing with higher storage requirements. I do care a great deal about security as well, so I list Windows support as kind of a pro and a con. It's harder to write a good trust model on Windows. And then for certificates and trusted keys at the bottom there, that basically means if you are somebody who expects a certain level of convenience over installing something, Zyden's going to feel very bureaucratic because right now it doesn't come with anything that makes it implicitly trust, common providers like Amazon or Microsoft or what have you. So you end up with this very, it feels kind of stifling because you have to say what you trust. But if you are security conscious, this may be preferable because now it won't do anything that will hurt your system. You have to provide affirmative consent to everything you do. That being said, this is still an ongoing project. It is available on GitHub at xyrolasting/Xiden, and if you're interested in its development, I really would appreciate your help. It does need a security audit, just because I really do believe independent security audits are very much a necessity in many projects. Windows optimizations are helpful since the commands feel slow on Windows. The translations are helpful if you want to, say, port many of the strings to Mandarin or Spanish or what have you. It would be wonderful to have this software available to more cultures. And then, of course, there's a closed beta. The closed beta being a place to host package definitions and related artifacts. This is a tall order. Anytime you're making a canonical source for artifacts, you have to care about things like being highly available and being able to preserve the same things all the time indefinitely. This takes money, and so funding would be very much appreciated if you're interested in seeing this project grow to support that kind of thing. And really that's it. I showed you a brief demo of Xiden, how it differs from RacketPackage, why it exists when RacketPackage Geeks and Nicks exists, and I really am excited to hear what you think about it. With that, I will take your questions. Thank you for listening.
All right, so thank you, Sage. Now we can move over to some questions. Okay. All right, so the first question is, do you think that this is something that can be integrated into the usual RacketPackage system, or do you think that this is a parallel system that people would, use independently?
Sure. First of all, you can hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you fine, and I assume that the live stream is working well.
Well, so it's an excellent question, and I got to tell you, I didn't want to write this thing. This was one of those projects where, I wanted to make sure that the contributions could go directly into RacketPackage itself, of course, because the more you interoperate with the ecosystem, the better off everybody would be. But a lot of this came down to collections. The fact is, a lot of my needs were better served when I did not use collections at all. And that is such a fundamental pillar to how the Racket ecosystem works right now, that when you sideline collections, you sideline Racket setup, and therefore you sideline the main way that you iterate on Racket packages and even the Racket repository itself. I briefly had this conversation on the developers mailing list, and the consensus right now seems to be we do need like a separate mode of operating. You'd have to have a separate Racket command. You'd have to have, I would hope you wouldn't need a separate service, but you would need to think of it as in parallel.
Okay. So another question. So someone says, are all Xiden packages installed in a kind of per project scope? How do you envision this working with source control? Are these like Git submodules? How do you imagine that working?
I would love to get some empirical data on that, because Git submodules are about at my pain threshold for Git. But I can tell you that I did think about per project scoping, since whenever I'm writing a project, there is a new context introduced when you bring in a third-party dependency into your project. You would think, oh, you have here's a package that, I don't know, does log tailing, right? Or log aggregation. And you'd think it behaves the same way everywhere. But when you introduce it into somebody else's project, you mix their opinions with the opinions of the package. It's not the same. So yes, I did think of it as in terms of, if I build a package and I link the output of my project, if I can control the name and the exact nature of integration as if it were a first party bit of code, then I think it's meant to follow whatever scoping or reasoning you want to put on it. So I think of project level scoping just because, I can put a definition in my project and get the dependencies that project needs. So that does apply, but it's not limited to that.
Okay. So someone asked the question, is it a useful analogy to think of RacketPackage as like apt-get on a normal Linux system, and Xiden as being more like Docker, where you might have your Xiden thing use RacketPackage, but with to tell it how to get something, from a particular Git checkout, etc. Or do you see them as parallel or layered in that way?
I see them as complementary. So, I would not see, Xiden as an alternative to Raco package in any sense, right? I believe that Raco package is a fundamental, again, pillar of how the ecosystem works now, and Xiden introduces a separate mode of operating. And it's one that's suitable for if you need to be sure that your installation is held constant as you add dependencies. Now, I would actually say that Raco package is more of a language dependency manager. There's an excellent article out there. I think the author's name is Sam Boyer. He talks about the differences of different classifications of dependency management tools. And he defines a language dependency manager, a system dependency manager, and I think it was one called PDM. I think that was project dependency manager. And Raco package is more language level. It introduces a lot of language level semantics in order to define a way for everybody to share work. Whereas Geeks and Nicks are more system level. Xiden is approaching system level, but currently sits kind of in between. It has a lot of Racket semantics in it right now, but I'm trying to make it agnostic enough that you can, of course, build self-hosting Xiden instances or even a Linux distribution in terms of installations.
Great. So that kind of leads into this next question where Xiden does, you talked about how it could integrate with external dependencies like pigments and whatnot. Do you imagine, like how far do you want to go down that road? Like, do you want to go down do you want to, be the non-Linux only Geeks, for instance? Or do you want to just hold that at sort of arm's length for you?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So it's like, what level of support do I aim to get with the project overall? Is that what I'm hearing?
Let me just read it. It says, so you mentioned pigments and other non-Racket dependencies. Sure. How deep do you go in making these reproducible? Geeks and Nicks go very far, which is their strength, but their limitation as well because they're Linux only.
Well, the Windows support is meant to help kind of rectify that. But the other aspect of this that does make it tricky, of course, is I can't personally add support for the glue between the Racket ecosystem and the Python ecosystem and the Ruby ecosystem and all that. There's a point where, I wish I had that power, but contributions would have to define that. This would have to be it would take a team effort to basically say, okay, well, I want to have Windows specific optimizations. Therefore, I want to have a definition here that will go out and use the Microsoft Visual C compiler and we'll get specific optimizations. That is something you can do, but me personally, I mean, I can do what I can, but it would probably be need-based.
Okay, so there are two questions that are very similar. So one person says, could you use the system to integrate with Nicks? And they say similar to how OCaml has something called a build Dune package, which is a way to connect OCaml to Nicks. Okay. And then someone else says, how hard would it be for me to convince you to use your experience to add Racket packages into Geeks directly?
This is actually an interesting question because I think I would have to answer those two separately. On the Geeks side, I actually drew more inspiration from Geeks than Nicks when trying to figure out the design. My deviations, of course, being I don't focus on profiles, I focus on issuing references. But the thing that I think there's a lot I don't know there because I really don't know what exactly defines what makes a acceptable Geeks package. What is their policy? What's their politics? I never focused on that. I was very focused on the specific problem I had for I need to get my dependencies reproducible without worrying about how people set up their Racket installations. I would be excited to see what it would be like to increase awareness for that in the Geeks community and introducing Racket packages. But I don't know if that's going to be in the capacity of strictly in Xiden being the driver of that or Racket packages in general, as in a Raco package in that sense. Mm-hmm. So I'm happy to talk about it. On the Nicks side, I would say that's more, repeat that question for me one more time.
So someone says, do you think that you could use this to integrate into Nicks, similar to how OCaml's build Dune package integrates OCaml packages into Nicks?
I believe so, yes. Just the short answer.
All right, cool. All right, now this is a question about your example. So someone says, how do installed packages refer to each other in your vendor example? Does this work with existing packages from package.racketlang.org?
Excellent question there. It really is the same way. The packages get references to their dependencies in the forms of symbolic links. And the way that Geeks and Nicks approach this is, since an installation is viewed as a function, as a pure function more or less, you can look at the input being the entire dependency graph. You get a cryptographic hash of all of the dependencies down, so that that's where you get the, the deterministic build and where you get no dependency hell. But it also means that if you have two packages A and B, and they each depend on C, they would each get the same reference, assuming it was really an identical version and everything else. Now, I did mention earlier that there's higher storage requirements. If you do have any variance in your dependency, you can get the dependency you want, but it's going to be a new copy, because Zyden doesn't know that, oh, okay, well, you have a different version of a package, but this one script's different, so I need to get the whole thing, right? Like, I don't know what else could be different. So that's what it looks like. But everything that's a dependent gets a link.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Also, I assume that there's no, you didn't go into the Racket runtime to deal with like issues where, imagine that I use version 1.3 and I define a struct, and you use version 1.4 and that defines a struct. So that means that a value that flows from one into the other will not be interoperable. Is that a correct understanding?
So if you have, to make sure I'm understanding you right, is it like that C problem where you try to get two header files and they each define a slightly different thing, and now you have to account for that in the middle? Is that kind of what you're
yeah, so like in Racket, structs are typically generative, meaning that one defined in one package, even if the fields are exactly the same, cannot be passed as a reference to an accessor function of the other package. And of course, if in a world where you actually have two instances of the same package, in your runtime system, you could have two instances of the exact same code, defining the same structure, but because the version is slightly different, because there's some other thing going on, these would be not interoperable. Is that correct?
Yeah. So that would be correct. If you have an identical package, you get the same directory. Hence, you instantiate the same module if you require it. But if if it varies enough where Zyden has reason to believe this is different, then yes, you are getting a different module. You're instantiating a different module. You're instantiating different bindings. You're getting new stuff.
Great. Okay, so there's no more questions. So we'll now, thanks, Sage, again.
Thank you.
And, we'll go now back to the gather. So in the Northeast region, discussion B, we'll have Sage, and in the Northwest region, discussion area A, that's where we'll have Brian. And our next speaker, our next session, I should say, will be in, let me just double check. Will be at 4:30, so which is in 1 hour. And so we'll have Pierce and Gustavo. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you in a little bit.